Chapter 43. The toast was actually pretty good when separated from the charcoal. Colin found the crispy texture of twice-cooked fluffy northern bread delightful, particularly when it was used in its intended purpose as a vector for butter and jam. The bacon was edible, once he showed Fenor-Axel how to drain it. Percy didn't have more than a nibble, but Fenor-Axel was a carnivore and Colin liked his food a little burned. Anna's eggs, in the end, were okay. Breakfast was altogether quite pleasant, more because of the company than the food. Colin did not for a second regret any of the waste that resulted from letting Fenor-Axel try her cloud cooking. It was fun, a warm, bright interaction with other people over a shared meal. Something he was only just beginning to realize how sorely he had missed. It was a most agreeable distraction from Colin's worries over the general future from here, how he was going to provide a comfortable living space for Percy, and at the forefront of his mind now, Isaiah. He both did and did not regret saying the things which had sent her off in a rage. He'd been right, and it had needed to be said. For now, he could only hope she would come around. In the meantime, Colin's inner debate about what to do next was preempted when Fenor-Axel let a comment slip. "City?" Percy repeated, sitting bolt upright. "A timekeeper city? Didn't you already show her that?" Colin asked. "I thought you gave her the whole tour yesterday." "I believe she's seen more of the complex than you have," Fenor-Axel countered. "But with specific exceptions. Mother was using the library, remember? I doubt she'd have objected to me bringing Percy past her, but the combination of a squishy little human and the mere possibility of Mother's annoyance prompted me to an excess of caution, and I stand by that decision." "I've certainly never been called squishy before," Percy said, frowning. "I do say there's something rather condescending about that." "Yes, my apologies, it was an ill-considered turn of phrase," Fenor-Axel agreed. "I let poetic license carry me away from accuracy. Considering the bone-to-flesh ratio, bipedal humanoids would be better described as crunchy." "Oh, I see," Percy said pensively. "I think that's the worst thing I've ever heard. Thank you." Fenor-Axel blinked, opened her mouth, and looked generally flummoxed. Hiding a smile, Colin stepped in to rescue her. After a judicious pause, "Of course. Well, Imar-Alafine is asleep in her chambers, which makes it a perfect time to show Percy the library, and what is beyond the library. If everyone's finished, shall we?" Incredible. The second they were through the doors, Percy let out that exclamation and rushed forward, bracing her hands against the ancient time-stone balustrade to lean out over the edge. The overgrown city spread out before her. "Yeah, that's exactly how I first. Look at the sky up here. The view of the stars is to be unparalleled. I can't believe I wasted last night indoors." "Not exactly how I first reacted," Colin corrected himself, blinking. Looks like it rained pretty heavily last night." Puddles lay across the landing onto which they'd emerged, and the leaves of the nearby climbing vines were still dripping heavily. The sky, however, was a brilliant deep blue, crossed by only a few faint wisps of cloud. "Really," Fenor-Axel drawled, "at a time like this, your first thought is to chat about the weather." "Don't be disingenuous, Fenor-Axel, you know very well why that was relevant. We stayed inside last night because there was a massive forest fire. That it rained a lot is important. Not to mention incredibly timely." "Incredibly is right," she agreed, now watching Percy as the princess craned her neck this way and that to peer around. "You should know, Colin, that weather magic is the kind of irresponsible act with unpredictable and wide-ranging complications that no sensible mage ever engages in. Mother has lectured me repeatedly on this subject, and would undoubtedly be hugely offended if anyone suggested she had ever done it herself. I am sure it is a pure coincidence that we frequently have unseasonable storms just as a big fire gets going in the nearby forest. That she dislikes the smell of wood smoke is surely just unrelated trivia." "That is an interesting piece of entirely tangential and irrelevant gossip," Colin said solemnly. "I'm sure it would be a waste of time to bring it up in Imar-Alafine's hearing." not to mention hazardous to your health. A dragon dislikes the smell of smoke? Percy asked, turning back to face them. Huh. That must be extremely tiresome for her. As Colin mentioned yesterday, different kinds of smoke have different smells, Phenorexa said, smiling. It's wood smoke specifically. Mother has had a very long and interesting life. I suspect it's associative. Smell is a powerful trigger of memory, even with the diminished sensory impact of a dragon's greater form. Diminished impact. Blinking, Percy tilted her head. There are a lot of fascinating things about dragons to learn, said Colin. More to the point, Percy, please don't mention any of this tour around Imaralafine. Ever. Oh. Okay. She's not dense, Colin, Phenorexa said irritably, the tip of her tail lashing. No, on the contrary, I appreciate clarifications, Percy said earnestly. I did not make the dissociation right away. I often don't make associations other people seem to expect. So. Sorry in advance if I'm rude. It's never on purpose. Oh. The dragon looked bemused by this turn. Well, then. Duly noted. But this really is amazing. Percy continued more enthusiastically, turning back to look out across the valley. I've never heard of a timekeeper ruin this huge. It really is a whole city. I'm no archaeologist, but even I know how important this must be. Who knew the dragons were just sitting on this for all these years? Also, if there's a whole uninhabited city right here, why do I need to sleep in Colin's room? The only thing more dangerous than an abandoned city is a mostly abandoned city, Percy, Colin explained. Though the timekeeper architecture itself is still intact, that place is full of natural hazards that have accumulated over the centuries. Rock slides, waterfalls, and tree overgrowth have made it difficult to navigate, and more of them could happen at any time as the surrounding cliffs decay. And that's not even touching on the living dangers. There are no large predators or other animals this close to the dragons, but it's the small ones you have to worry about. Snakes, scorpions, spiders. I have the Phantom Legion patrolling here, but I'm not sure how effective even they would be against that. Keeping pests out is a constant, ongoing struggle in cities, and requires massive organization, numerous specialists and unskilled laborers, and well-enforced public health codes. One person, basically camping in one of the buildings. The whole valley is a habitat for potentially venomous critters, and they would all go right to you to get at whatever supplies you kept. And you'd be out here, isolated. If something happened, there's no telling if we would even notice, much less reach you in time. He joined her at the rail while he talked. By the end, Percy was nodding, wearing a frown. I see. That makes sense, thank you for explaining. I wouldn't have thought about that. Also, it belatedly occurs to me that my suggestion was rather ungrateful, considering all the effort you put forth to create a lovely residence for me. I apologize, Colin, for speaking so thoughtlessly. I very much appreciate all you've done for me. I was not offended, but I accept your apology, he said, smiling. Is it too unsafe to explore? Because I've never thought of myself as an adventurous person, but I think if I stand this close to the only extant timekeeper city and don't actually go poke around in it a bit, I will never be able to sleep again. Well, it depends. He half turned to regard her thoughtfully. How experienced are you with, shall we call it, wilderness exploration? Well, if you define wilderness exploration to include occasional walks in the palace gardens and very rare, heavily supervised visits to city parks for some formal occasion, then still, not very. Percy winced, looking away. Franz, that's my stepbrother, calls me one of Boisvert's great endorswomen. So, never mind, I guess. Now, hold on, Colin said gently. While I still wouldn't recommend trying to live in that city as it is, a lot of it remains very workable. I've wandered pretty far into there, myself, and nothing happened. As long as you stay clear of any ledges or flooded areas and watch your step, And don't go into any dark buildings where the gods only know what might be lurking. It's probably fine. What I'd recommend is that you don't go in there alone, Percy. But it's hard to be any safer than in the company of a dragon. They can ward off basically any danger, and even if a mishap occurs. Well, dragons know a lot of magic, even the young ones. Right, Phanorexa? It depends on the dragon, Phanorexa mused. Any of the elders, yes, absolutely. Very little could breach their protection, and certainly nothing out there. Not that I'd recommend asking any of them to escort you on a walk, but I can certainly look out for a friend. I know about as much healing magic as the average adventuring cleric, at least. Really? Colin asked, raising his eyebrows. I've gotta say, I didn't take you for a medically minded person. She raised her chin haughtily. My mother believes in a well-rounded education, a priority with which I wholeheartedly concur. Are all dragons your age so powerful and versatile? Percy asked, blinking. What about, your siblings? Venomax and the Green One? Colin had to repress his amusement, both at her and at Phanorex's reaction. From a lot of people, Percy's question could have been taken as funning obsequiousness, but she simply looked curious and maybe a little confused. Poor Phanorexa strikingly resembled her mother in that moment, torn between flattery and annoyance. Yes, well, generally, I should think. I have no idea what magic those two know. Neither of them are exactly great thinkers, but it would be absurd for dragons our age not to possess a significant arsenal of spells. I think it's very sad that you don't get along with your siblings, Percy stated with a straightforward frankness that Colin could only envy. I would hate to imagine life without friends. I still miss my birth parents, especially my father, but now I have a brother and two new mothers and they are most of what makes life seem worth it. Phanorexa stared at her, obviously at a complete loss. Percy, though, turned away to frown across the cityscape spread out below them. They must be so upset, she said, so quietly Colin could only just make out the words. I am going to miss them a lot. But this was the right thing. They've been good to me and I was only ever a problem. It'll be better for them now. Mouth hanging slightly open, Phanorexa drew her eyebrows together in an expression of utter befuddlement. After a second she turned helplessly to Colin, eyes pleading. He glanced between her and Percy, thought rapidly, and reached out with his senses to check on the dragons throughout the mountain. What he discerned made him decide to take a chance here. Phanorexa is the most well-read person I know, said Colin, and that is really saying something. I literally grew up in the library. Well, I suppose Mayor Olafine has probably read more, but Phanorexa is catching up at a phenomenal rate. If you're curious about the timekeepers, Percy, I doubt there's anyone who could better guide you through the ruins. Especially since you would be as safe with her as you possibly could be. What do you say, Phanorexa? Are you willing to show our guest the sights? Percy turned, her pained expression suddenly coming alight with interest. Oh, would you? It wouldn't be a burden. Yes, well. Phanorexa cleared her throat, then tossed her head proudly. Well, I was planning to do some reading today, but I can do that any time. I more or less do. And it is rather pleasant to share my knowledge with a person of sufficient intellect to appreciate it. Yes, I believe I could make time to show you around, Percy. Just so very much like her mother. The only thing she seemed to have inherited from Atraximos was the snide sense of humor. That sounds wonderful, thank you so much, Percy said with enthusiasm. Colin, will you be joining us? I'm going to regret missing out on Phanorex's historical annotations, but in fact I need to go attend to some more family business today. I will check in on you soon, though. You girls have fun. Okay, we will. So what do you know about the timekeepers, Phanorexa? It was my understanding that they were very mysterious. Almost definitionally, yes, the dragon agreed as the two of them carefully descended the steps to the next level. Practically nothing is known about them save for what everyone already knows, which is practically nothing. But I have personally investigated this city very thoroughly over the last century, including some of the sections that are now underwater, and some most intriguing inferences can be made from the structures here that I have not seen recorded by any other commenters writing on the subject. Colin listened to their diminishing voices with a smile, even as he returned his focus to his dragon sense. Mostly no surprises. 2 of his wives were sleeping in their chambers, and Iziroa was still painfully notable by her absence. Vadaril, she was again Joyce whooping around the nearby peaks. He hoped she would have the sense not to dive-bomb Percy and her sister, and that Phanerexa would contain the situation rather than exacerbate it if she did not. Upon reflection, perhaps he had better keep half an eye on them. What most interested Colin at this moment was Vanomax, who was very uncharacteristically still, silent, and on the ground. The dragon stood upon the plateau to the south of the mountain ridge, close to where Colin himself had first approached the complex, staring in the direction of distant Rivak. He fixed his attention, focused his will, and the world blurred around him. Suddenly Colin was standing upon the prairie, seeing Vanomax with his eyes rather than just his dragon sense, with the vast flatlands stretching infinitely before them and the mountains rising behind. Vanomax jerked violently, whipping his head around to stare at Colin, and immediately his expression fell into a scowl. "What the hells do you want?" "Oh, man, that's a bigger question than I think you realize," Colin said. "What do I want? Well, I guess most of it can be summed up as peace. I want us all to have a secure home and not be bothered by the succession of threats and annoyances that we definitely are about to be. I want to get to know everybody better, all 6 of you, as individuals, and as a family. I want this to be a family, not just the loose and tense alliance of overlapping mutual interests I found here. What I really want is for us all to get along, to trust and care about each other, for each of us to know without having to doubt or think about it that there are 6 others who unquestioningly have our back through whatever the hell happens to us all next." Slowly, Vanomax reared up to his full height, until he was staring down the length of his pointed nose at Colin from a good 2 stories up. "That might be the single most absurd thing I have ever heard anyone suggest." "I know, right?" Colin grinned up at him. "It sounds pretty crazy when I say it out loud. That's probably why I've been reluctant to. But hey, since I'm apparently on course to become the god of dragons, maybe it's appropriate for me to have ridiculously lofty dragon-related ambitions. It's not like dragons ever do anything halfway." "Yeah, I get your point. It might be simpler if I followed Tiavatharus's suggestion of using the Phantom Legion to conquer the Evervils by force." Vanomax snorted and ruffled his wings momentarily before folding them back down. "I interpreted her comment as suggesting you should refrain from doing that." "Well, that's good, since I am not planning to. See? Making progress already." The dragon sneered and turned away, once again staring at the horizon. "My old mentor gave me a piece of advice that I keep coming back to," Colin continued. "When faced with a task that is overwhelming in scope, you must break it down into smaller pieces. And if necessary, break down those pieces into smaller tasks still, as many times as it takes to reduce the whole to a set of achievable goals. And then take them on one at a time. So coming here to pester me is a small step toward your ludicrous fantasy of forging some grandiose dragonheart box?" Colin shrugged, smiling. "Well, look at us, having an awkward conversation when we don't really want to. That's exactly what families do. Part of it, anyway." "I thought you were an orphan." "Family are the people you find yourself stuck with. Birth is only one of the ways for that to happen. Not even the most interesting." Slowly, Vanomax lowered his head. Still staring into the distance, he seemed not quite conscious of the action. It gave him a hangdog look, with his nose toward the ground and neck arched in an almost hunched posture. "Mother has told me the same thing, often enough. Breaking up a big task. She's probably where my own mentor heard it from. Her writings are basically gospel to those of us who serve Rivac. I never had anything huge I particularly wanted to accomplish. Well, except kill Atraximos, but that was an immense enough challenge that even the smallest goals I could break it down into were going to take me centuries each. Seems pointless now, of course. Even so, I listened. I remember everything she's taught me. He ruffled his wings again, letting his head sink lower. I haven't exactly been the best student of her teachings. Colin nodded slowly, pacing forward until he stood even with Vanamix's head, staring alongside him in the same direction. Between the two of us, we piss her off good and proper, this time. Has she done this before? Disappeared like this? Not like this, Vanamix rumbled. She goes off to Rivkabut from time to time, discreetly. I've never seen her storm off in a rage before. It really didn't seem like her. Yeah. Well. Crap. Millimeters. They stood in silence for a few minutes, staring glumly at nothing and listening to the wind shiver the patchy grass around them. Why did you stick up for me? Vanamix asked quietly. Because I was correct. And believe me, in hindsight I'm having doubts. I don't think that's a good enough reason to say something hurtful to someone you love. I guess. I wouldn't know. Colin nodded. They were silent another handful of heartbeats. It was he who broke it this time. Well, what do we do now? Vanamix heaved an annoyed sigh, deliberately emitting a puff of smoke from his nostrils. Yep, Colin was reminded that he was correct about the smell. More like hot metal than wood or oil smoke. It's not like there's anything we can do, until she decides to come home. I don't know whether she'll have calmed down or gotten angrier by then. Either way, we are in for it. Me more than you, I bet. You're probably right. What about in the meantime, then? Just sitting around waiting always seems like a waste of time to me, no matter what it is you're waiting for. Surprisingly, Vanamix grinned, twisting his neck to look down at him again. Yeah. Well, I know how Vidaralshi and I deal with tension like this. It's a good way to clear the air. You really wouldn't be interested, though. Oh. Colin turned to face him head-on, folding his arms and raising an eyebrow. Try me. Chapter 44. Colin was not a fighter. Even in the rougher taverns he and the other scribes had sometimes frequented, he'd always been proud of his ability to talk his way out of fights with even the most drunk and aggressive dockworkers. So he had simply never realized how liberating it felt to just haul off and punch someone in the face. Especially if that someone was a dragon. Vanamax was right, this felt good. Vanamax's head was whipped back by the force of the hit, but he retaliated instantly with his claws, slashing across Colin's whole upper body and forcing him to block. One of Colin's old drinking buddies had been a city guard who insisted on showing all the scribe's basic moves whenever she was hammered, so he could block a punch. Even if the way the crossed forearms in front of his face protected him from a talon that could have picked him up was almost comical. With a roar, the dragon sank his rear claws into the ground and beat his wings, creating a burst of wind that made Colin stagger back a few steps. In the moment he was off balance, Vanamix whipped around fully, smacking him with a sweep of his tail. Colin was sent flying. He landed on his feet, hard, but continued to slide with the force of the blow, leaving 2 long rents in the ground beneath him before he ground to a halt, and that was when he really processed that something was very wrong about all this. Moving or being moved in that way was absurd. He just wasn't heavy enough. Under normal physics, being hit like that would have pulverized him. Under the modified godling physics he'd been working with, being attacked by dragons was a complete non-experience, having zero effect on him while he stood like a time-stone pillar. Indeed, the first couple of awkward blows had gone that way, until he'd concentrated and... Well, this was new. Vanamix charged across the ground toward him, and grinning in liberated delight, Colin rushed to meet him. He got in 2 good punches before the dragon seized him in his jaws and threw him skyward, another thing he'd been specifically unable to do previously. Colin teleported right back to the ground at his side and shoulder checked him in the ribs, which hit way harder than should have been possible because Venomax not only toppled over onto his sides but skidded across the ground. They circled, charged, struck, retreated, trading blows and repeatedly flinging each other back, but suffering no damage to speak of. Colin, in the back of his mind, was becoming aware of new things even as he focused his attention on what he was doing. Venomax's emotional state, for one. Fortunately he was actually enjoying this too. More importantly, though, was the rising pressure of his godhead subtly expanding. Venomax shot aloft, sailing around in a tight arc to strafe Colin with a blast of fire. The heat and flames had no effect on him, as usual. He teleported to a position directly above the dragon and clobbered him with a double-handed blow, sending them both crashing back down to Earth, where they rolled for a short distance exchanging slashes and slaps before separating again. The difference was obvious, now that he thought about it. Colin wasn't just passively being impervious to dragons, but actively maintaining control over it. He was not frustratingly impossible for Venomax to assail, nor was he truly vulnerable. Nor, for that matter, was he instinctively reacting to and perfectly repelling every attack as he had with Vaidaralshi. He had latched onto an emotional need, the desire to clear the air between them, and forged a new aspect of his powers out of it. Who knew that play fighting was all it would take? This was important, he sensed. His actual capabilities were expanding, sure, but that came with a metaphysical change. He could feel it in the welling up of the power within him, growing in a way it hadn't since his confrontation with the Traximos. This was not lording over dragons, but meeting one on his own level. Also, it was still fun. He found himself grinning as he kicked one of Venomax's legs out from under him and nailed him with an uppercut when he overbalanced. So was Venomax, who retaliated by sweeping Colin aside with one wing, then driving him further back with a jab to his chest from his tail. Back home, Colin had privately disdained people who could only seem to settle differences with their fists. He was a man of words. It was starting to feel like he owed some people apologies. Colin darted forward again, tracking unpredictably back and forth as he charged and forcing Venomax to guess where the blow would fall. Too wise to play along, Venomax opened his jaws, flickers igniting along his teeth as he prepared to blast Colin back again. A deafening roar split the air, ringing off the mountains behind them. She plunged down at a steep angle, landing so hard that the earth trembled and Colin nearly lost his footing. Instantly, Iziro surged forward from her impact point, placing herself between them and flattening her entire body to the earth, neck and head pressed to the ground and wings lowered to either side. "Husband, please?" The open pleading in her tone took him aback. Belatedly, he recognized her posture as one of submission. Absolutely the last thing he had ever expected to see from her. "I beg you, Colin, don't. Please. All of this is my fault. I will take full responsibility. I will make this right. If you will only show my son mercy." Whoa, wait. He babbled in horror, finally catching on. Colin frantically waved his hands. "No, it's not like that. It's fine, everything's fine." "It's okay, Mother," Venomax added, skittering around her to place himself in her field of view at Colin's side. "He's not doing anything to me. We were just, playing." There was silence as her golden eyes stared at them, pupils narrowed to bare slits, unblinking. Very slowly, she lifted her head off the ground. "Playing." He had never heard her speak in such a flat tone. A little sparring," Colin explained. "It's good exercise. It's a good way to, work things out," Venomax added. "Have some fun, get the heartbeat up and get out of our own heads. Colin is. Well, he's an okay sort, I guess." Staring down at them, Iziro got back to her feet, folding her wings with great dignity. Slowly her head swiveled as she took in the surrounding landscape. Craters and rents marring the ground where they had impacted and slid, the wide swath of prairie grass that was still on fire. Finally, She emitted a snort of pure exasperation and sat down hard enough to shake the earth again. Boys. PSSD? Vanamax lowered his head to Colin's level, muttering in a tone that was still definitely within her hearing. How do you think we should tell her we both learned this from Vedaralshi? You tell her, Colin muttered back at the same volume. I'm hoping to sleep with her again later. Izaroa let out a long, heavy sigh, complete with a stream of hot smoke which was fortunately dispersed well above their heads. Vanamax, she finally said, you and I must speak. At length. Vanamax tensed, hunching behind his wings reflexively. And that is not a euphemism, she added. Izaroa stepped forward, lowering her head toward him, and Vanamax instinctively drew back. She pushed on into his space, however, and rather than striking out as he seemed to fear, leaned in to press her forehead against his. After a surprised second, he relaxed, nuzzling back into her. This will be a conversation. There are things I require you to explain, but a great many more I must say to you. It will take considerable time. I also need to have a private word with Colin. But as this should be a much shorter discussion, I ask that you go inside to my chambers and wait for me there. I wish to handle this part now, so that I can give you my undivided attention for what is likely to be the remainder of the day. Of course. Yes, Mother. Vanamax swiveled his head to look at Colin, parted his jaws again as if to say something else, and then hesitated. Instead, he turned and paced a short distance away from them, spreading his wings and taking off as soon as he had clearance. Izaroa watched him go until he had swooped around toward the front entrance to the mountain lair, then turned her head back to Colin. For a long moment, she just stared down at him, reptilian expression inscrutable. Are you all right? Colin asked carefully. The dragon's enormous chest swelled momentarily in another sigh, and she looked away from him. I have spent the night in uncomfortable contemplation, and come to conclusions which greatly trouble me. There are things I need to say to you, Arkansas Colin, difficult things. I ask that you allow me to get through it uninterrupted, before we converse again. Of course, Colin said. Whatever you need. He clung to his composed expression with every last fiber of strength he possessed, even as he felt his stomach drop right into the earth beneath him, leaving behind a sucking sensation that consumed his entire torso. This was it. He knew what was coming. She was done with him, about to announce her departure. And he'd brought it on himself. What had possessed him to speak to her that way? Izaroa lowered herself again, settling with all four legs tucked beneath her body, but with her neck still arched, head still turned to gaze away at the horizon. Of course. Dumping someone must be awkward enough without making eye contact. You have not asked, she finally said after apparently composing herself for a long span of seconds, but Vanamax has no rank in Rivak, nor will he. The nature of dragon parenting and human political succession is incompatible. My empire has no parents. In my capacity as empress, I have no family. Since we are on the topic, Colin, this applies to you as well. Thus, Vanamax is no part of imperial business. Separately, in my life as a private individual watching over my empire from a safe distance, I have a son with whom I have shared my days these last 12 decades. She paused again, and Colin nodded, waiting for her to go on. It wasn't as if he had anything to say, even had she not asked him to let her get through it. His voice would probably have humiliatingly cracked. He would definitely have been able to conjure up nothing but incoherent pleas for her not to do what she was doing. Instead of subjecting them both to that, Colin kept his full mouth shut and waited for her to finish explaining how he'd just lost her. Obviously. Atraximos would never have tolerated me raising my offspring as his other consorts did, as successors to their own special interests. To groom an heir to expertise in politics and administration would require heavy involvement with mortals. His father would have found that idea offense in the extreme, and even apart from his bullheaded perfidy, there would be no way to do that without obviating any chance we might have of privacy. Realistically, I could not hope to conceal my identity for a century of interacting with mortals if I were training a young dragon to be able to rule over them competently and beneficently. And even if I proclaimed that my son was not to be the heir to Rivak, the mere knowledge of him would have created ongoing political complications the Empire does not need. So I have simply raised him as a dragon, to know and to do the things a dragon ought. She finally looked at Colin again, turning her head back to fix her gaze upon him. He still couldn't quite parse her expression, but didn't really need to. He knew what this was all leading up to, even if he didn't yet see how she was going to get there from here. Colin was fully occupied keeping himself outwardly composed. I could, however, have done more. Not to the extent of raising him as a proper heir, but more. I am not blind to the fact that Tiavathyres and Imaralaphine have both brought up their daughters in ways to which Atraximos was blind. He was paranoid, but self-centered and never terribly interested in his offspring so long as they stayed out of his way. I could have taught Vanomax more about, well, many things. It is not as if I taught him nothing, please don't think that. We have had over a century and spoken on countless subjects. I've told him at great length about my interests and likes. He has listened attentively. And for long years, I thought that would be enough. That when he was ready to leave the lair, it would be as a proud dragon with a somewhat greater understanding of mortal hearts and minds than most, and free of his sire's moral inadequacies. Once more, Izairo paused, turning to look away. Then she turned back, visibly forcing herself to face him. Colin steeled himself. It was coming. It is only in the last few days, watching how poorly Vanomax has coped with the abrupt changes in our lives, that I have recognized what I should have seen developing long since. I haven't taught him to love the things I love, but only to love me. Hence his reluctance to depart on his own. Both he and Fenurixa are old enough that Atraximos was beginning to make noises about evicting them. I have. Heaving another sigh, Izairo lowered her head, in fact, let it hang in a way Colin had never seen, nose pointed at the ground. Her eyes closed as if she couldn't stand to look at the world while she admitted what was on her heart. It is a more painful thing than you can imagine, husband, to realize that you have failed your child. Especially when they are an adult, and it is too late. Empathetic as you are, until you have your own children, I truly don't believe you can actually understand how that aches, how it burns. The one ultimate responsibility I had to my son, to prepare him to be his own person and face the world without me. I let him down. I cultivated his utmost love and trust in me and then betrayed them. She opened her eyes again, resolute, meeting his gaze. Now she lowered her head properly, facing him from closer to the ground. At his own level. Terrible as that offense was, it can be defended. It was not deliberate. The choices I made seemed sensible at the time, their consequences only revealed in hindsight. I do not have the luxury of that defense for any of what followed. As I drew closer to recognizing my ultimate failure, instead of facing it as an empressat, I pushed it away, hid my mind from it. And worst of all, when you brought it forth for me to confront, Colin, I lashed out at you like a beast. What you told me was exactly what I most needed to hear. More than that, you spoke with such compassion and concern for me, when in that moment you'd have been fully justified in holding my head to the floor until I listened, as you did to Tiavathyres. And that is how I repaid you. Once more, Izairo flattened herself fully to the ground, prostrating herself before him. Colin stared at her, feeling as if he were in free fall. What was happening? Was she not going to? Her golden eyes closed and she spoke so softly that even the immense power of her voice did not overcome its quietude. Never since the earliest days of my youth have I failed so utterly, or shamed myself so deeply. I vow to you, husband, that whatever it requires, I will make this right. In such a short time, I have learned to appreciate you, the incredibly good fortune that has brought you to me. Not only because of the opportunities you present as a godling, perhaps not even most because of that, but because of the person you are. What you are trying, and already beginning to succeed at doing for me, for us, for this family. I promise, husband, henceforth I shall appreciate it better. I humbly beg your forgiveness." All he could do was stare. She wasn't abandoning him. It almost didn't make sense. Could you actually provoke a loved one like that and they not retaliate? Speaking up as he had at all had been a risky impulse, a strange act for him, no doubt prompted by all the recent sweeping changes in his life. It had been so contrary to everything Colin understood, his well-practiced certainty that being right was the opposite of an asset and arguing with a romantic partner. She was apologizing? He could see her point, see why she was in the wrong. That didn't make it less surreal. Colin was suspended, hanging between relief so palpable he tingled with it all the way to his fingertips and utter confusion. Then Isaroa opened her eyes, and he realized he'd been standing there like an obelisk, letting her welter in it. Unforgivable. Yep, his voice cracked. Colin had to pause and clear his throat. It seems like I keep having to say this recently, but I'm in no position to judge you. As a ruler, or a dragon, or even as a parent, it's not like I know anything about any of that. You're right. All I know how to be is a person, and when a person makes a mistake, their character can only be judged by how they make amends. Stepping forward, he reached out to lay a hand against the glossy scales of her muzzle, resisting the impulse to lean against her. His own legs felt weak. He was having to reassure her, to perform without having had the time to process the relief that he had not just lost her, and it turned out that unprocessed relief could leave a fellow unsteady. But he performed anyway, because that was what he did. "I have never mistaken you for perfect," Colin said gently, "so you haven't disappointed me. My faith in you is undiminished. I have the utmost confidence that you will be able to overcome whatever problems result from all this. And it may not be a smooth journey, but that's fine. I'll be here to support you, whenever you stumble and whenever you don't. I promise I won't think less of you if you don't get everything exactly right the first time." Her huge form swelled again as she inhaled. He could actually feel the breeze pressing at his back from the force of the air she was drawing in. And then, finally, she shifted. There she was, standing a head taller than he rather than towering like a living palace, and she wrapped her claws around him, pulling him into a hug. Finally Colin let himself lean against her, let himself catch his own breath. They were silent for several minutes, only holding each other, appreciating being together. Gently she stroked his back, from head to waist, with one claw, but otherwise they didn't move. "I am grateful, Colin," Isaroa finally said, softly. "Out of all the people who might have stepped into your role, unprecedented as it was, I am so glad it was you." She leaned down to press her forehead against his, and Colin nuzzled her back in the dragon manner. Then he shifted slightly to kiss her, and she adjusted her grip on him, reciprocating with gentle fervor. Only then, finally, did she lighten her grasp and begin to pull back. Colin felt a twinge at letting her go, but did so without complaint. He could, now that he knew it wouldn't be the last time. "And now I must go spend some considerable time and attention on my son," she said, smiling. "I'll look forward to having more with you, husband, but I believe at least part of Vanamix's dismay stems from being suddenly ignored while I direct all my focus at a new person in our lives. I think you're right. It's probably best if you make sure not to deny him too much of your time, going forward. That works out well, as you have other consorts to appease. I don't believe either of them have yet begun to resent the share of your own attention I have taken up these last few days, but I suspect it would take a little more carrying on as we have before that begins to accrue. Best to ward off family disputes rather than have to resolve them after the fact." "Words to live by," he agreed fervently. Isaroa hesitated a moment, then reached out. Gently sliding one claw around behind his head again, she pulled him forward and bent to rub her nose alongside his, once. "Beloved," she whispered. And then she had pulled away, and stepped back. Colin also retreated 2 paces as she changed back. With a beat of her immense wings that cast a gale across the plateau, Izaroa threw herself aloft, and arced away around the mountain. Left behind, Colin held out only until he was certain he was alone again, then let out a ragged breath and sat down right where he stood. He managed not to flop into a complete fetal position, catching himself on his arms as he leaned back and tilted his neck to stare up at the clear morning sky. At least the ground in this particular spot wasn't wet. Last night's rain still soaked the area, but in this little patch, sections had been baked dry by nearby dragonfire. Colin breathed in and out, slowly regaining his equanimity. He had been so certain in that moment it was all about to end. Right now he couldn't even put names to all the emotions whirling around him, so he just sat there, giving them time to settle down. "I thought you handled it very well." At the sudden voice, Colin heaved an exasperated sigh, closing his own eyes for a moment. "I'm sure you don't need me to tell you this, but that is your great gift, White. No. You're good at handling people. Even when you don't have the wherewithal to fix your own angst, you've always got the energy to make someone else feel better. Just be sure to remember moderation. Those dragons'll walk all over you without meaning any harm if you don't stick up for your own needs." When he opened his eyes again and looked off to the side, there it was. His own shadow, stretching away across the ground until the point where it didn't, instead lifting off it to hover as an indistinct dark blur in the air. "I really don't have the energy for you right now," he said. "Which is why you're here, isn't it? You're really good at picking vulnerable moments to exploit." What's interesting to me is how much of a difference your own mindset makes and how you interpret that. You being in prison on death row was certainly a vulnerable moment, and I sure don't recall you complaining about my help then. You're not wrong, Colin. I deal pretty much exclusively with desperate people in unfortunate situations. Who else needs the kind of intervention they'd get from me? Let's just abridge this conversation, shall we? Colin sighed. You want me to turn my focus back to Rivkabad, to Hactria and the Lord Scribe? I ask why you're so adamant about that. You say something evasive. Good talk, looking forward to next time. Hey, can be and drop by and visit old friends and business partners from time to time. What I'm seeing here is you having just finished what should have been a wholesome and affirming moment with your spouse and reacted the second she was gone as if you'd had your stuffing ripped out. Look at yourself, Colin. This is not healthy. It's not even normal. You are going to run yourself absolutely ragged unless you opened up to this family you're working so hard to cultivate. Doesn't matter how silver-tongued or socially adroit a person is, one man cannot manage this many extremely large personalities to their own benefit all on his own. You have got to start letting them take care of you in turn. I think you'd find yourself surprised how willing they are to do so. Colin said sourly. And being dragons, part of that taking care will involve herring off to Rivkabad to enact revenge on those who've wronged me, which of course is the only part you care about. That is one thing that's likely to happen, yes, although if we are being realistic, Izaroa is the only one with a claim there and won't tolerate the others messing about on her turf. But that is only one of the things that will likely happen, Colin, and from where you're sitting right now, one of the less important. My guy, by every meaningful measure you've won. The power and wealth and security at your fingertips now is positively unreal. And yet, here you are, driven to literal collapse by the ongoing emotional issues you keep refusing to address. How much longer do you think you can keep on this way? I'll tell you what. Colin shuffled about without getting up, turning himself to face the floating shadow more directly. You refuse to tell me why my revenge is so important to you? Fine. You say you can't tell me? Fine, fine. That's not necessarily implausible. There are countless reasons anyone might need to keep details like that discreet, and I have no idea what kind of rules apply to whatever kind of a thing it is you are. It was a god, he was all but certain. Probably a lesser one, but definitely a god of revenge. But can you tell me why you can't tell me? If you're not going to just leave me alone. If we follow this enough layers down, Surely there's eventually some reason you can provide that I should at least consider trusting you. Because right now, I'm coming up short. I guess being the entire reason you are in the wonderful position you're in instead of murdered in a jail cell isn't reason enough? Those are some pretty lofty standards, Colin. I don't think anything can surpass that. It's not that I don't appreciate all of that. It's just the absolute certainty that all of it was a side effect of your plan towards some goal I don't even know, because you refuse to tell me. So my question stands. What can you tell me? Well, the entity mused, slowly wavering back and forth in the air, I guess it's not unreasonable to. It happened too fast that Colin's specialized senses provided no warning. Even as he felt the rise of powerful dragon-cast magic around them, the world seemed to tilt. The senses for which he had names told him nothing was different in their surroundings, but it felt as if gravity had reversed, or the air had turned to moonlight, something fundamental yet ineffable altered just in the space around him. The only visible cue to the effect was around the entity, its dark form left floating in the air, and suddenly different than he had ever seen it. There was a form to it now, a shape he could recognize. It remained translucent, but had a crisp outline, resembling a transparent person-shaped shell full of smoke. By the time he'd noticed this, Colin had also sharpened his focus upon the magic. Feeling it cast by a dragon, he could discern much about its nature, but within limits prescribed by his own starkly limited understanding of magic itself. Exactly what this working was doing he'd have needed a more thorough education to articulate, but he could discern the general sense of it. In this one spot, the rules were changed, limiting the capabilities of metaphysical entities within its area of effect. And focusing thus, he sensed it coming when she teleported. The magic swelled, and suddenly she was towering over them both, her white scales practically glowing in the sunlight as she bent her neck to grin directly at the entity. Finally, Alafine said smugly. Got you. Chapter 45. Colin had lived through enough moments in his life in which everything fell apart that he was practically a connoisseur of them. To his surprise, now that this one had arrived, he found that it wasn't all that bad, to the point he was almost unsure what he'd been so worried about. In the worst case, he still had all the power here. Which was not to say he didn't now have some explaining to do. How's that expression go? He asked aloud. Fuck around and find out. For someone who was so afraid of attracting Alafine's notice, you've been awfully cavalier about. Oh, please, the entity retorted in a tone of good-humored ribbing, its voice undisturbed by whatever effect was now laid over it. Don't even try to take credit for this, it's not like you tipped her off. You know what, that's a very good point. Colin grinned up at the dragon, finding to his surprise that he didn't have to force the expression. I know it shouldn't surprise me at all that you of all people pulled off the impossible, but still, well done. I don't even know what this thing is, but it's been awfully resistant to revealing any weaknesses. It's a god, husband, she stated, smirking. Just a little one, the entity said innocently. Not to mention a bit of fascinating context, Alafine continued. Gods are difficult creatures to analyze if they choose not to cooperate, but even at a glance I can tell that this one's divine aspect is related in some way to stealth, which answers the looming questions I've had about how you waltzed blithely past all our senses and Atraximos's preposterously over-14.HOARD network before you were even a godling. Also, it is a particularly weak and thus likely young specimen of its kind, if I was able to perceive that much. All of that slots together very neatly, Colin mused. Well, I suppose this calls for some explanations. Oh, you had better believe I expect to receive them, she said pointedly, but it calls first for a change of venue. I require surroundings providing firmer control, and for that matter, I confess I am not the only party to whom these explanations are owed. She called forth magic again. Colin could tell this was a teleportation spell at a glance, but it had multiple layers of additional effects he couldn't interpret. That was all the time he had to think about it before the world blurred around him, and suddenly he, Alafine, and the imprisoned entity were all in the middle of the central timekeeper vault of their lair. so was the peculiar distortion in the air that was apparently keeping the little god captive. Colin had barely caught his bearings when Alafine raised her head and emitted a trumpeting roar which echoed off the enclosed walls at such a deafening intensity that, well, actually, it did nothing to him. Apparently this counted as dragon-generated harm, and so Colin suffered no discomfort even though the intensity of the sound caused the very air to tremble around him. He hoped Percy was still outside. He sensed the other dragons react immediately, though, much faster than they usually did. Izyroa and Venomox instantly broke off their conversation and surged out into the central hall, as did Tiavathyris from her own lair. Colin actually sensed the magical pulse she sent out, which caught Vidaralshia's attention and brought the younger green swooping back toward the main entrance. Phenorexa was in the library, not outside, and responded the slowest. Hopefully she was making sure their guest was all right. "And what have we here?" Tiavathyris inquired, arching her neck to peer down at Colin and the imprisoned shadow, still contained within a cage of moonlight. "Our husband has some things he wishes to explain, when everyone is gathered," Alafine said primly. "Before anyone overreacts, you know that I respect a person's privacy as much as anyone. But this troublesome little thing has been snooping about intermittently since he arrived, and that I will not countenance with good grace until I receive certain assurances." "More than fair," Colin said, carefully projecting calm. "I would like some myself. Perhaps you can aid me in getting them. I haven't had much luck." "Oh, I am delighted to be of service, husband," Alafine said, lowering her head nearly to ground level and grinning at him. "I believe I can intuit the general shape of it at a glance," Tiavathyris murmured as Vidaralshi darted into the room, head up in an alert posture and for once not goofing around. Colin was honestly impressed at how seriously they took this sounding of the alarm. They hadn't even pulled together like this during his confrontation with the Traximos. Phenorexa was the last to arrive, though she had spent the interim right there in the library. Alafine swiveled her head to give her daughter a baleful stare, likely for that very reason, so Colin stepped in before she could speak. "Is Percy all right?" "She's reading quietly," Phenorexa replied, pacing over to join the group with her gaze fixed upon the entity. "Seems to be mostly recovered." Recovered? What in the hells had happened to Percy? He'd left them alone for a few minutes. Colin was forced to prioritize, though. If the princess was currently safe and sound, he had more immediate affairs to get squared away before he could attend to her. "What is this critter meant to be?" Venomox demanded, extending his neck to sniff at the entity, which waved at him. "A deity." Izyroa tugged her son back by his tail, golden eyes fixed on the being in question. "A minor one, I should think. Likely lesser in power than any of us." "Yes, hence my ability to restrain it," Alafine agreed. "But challenging gods never comes down to raw power. A god is a focus of reality, a nexus of existence governed only by its own rules, which it then imposes upon the world. To truly defeat a god one must understand their nature and use it against them. Otherwise, no amount of power will avail you against a creature which can determine the terms by which your power may be used." "And yet you seem to have this one neatly wrapped up, mother," said Phenorexa. "Yes," Alafine said pointedly, swiveling her head back to stare down at the patiently waiting entity. "Yes, with remarkable ease. Almost as if it wants to be held," Izyroa finished quietly. "It's a subtle thing," the white dragon continued. "I am solidly certain that subtlety is part of its divine nature, perhaps one of its core aspects. But still, I have sensed something sniffing around at the edges of perception, at very particular times and places. In the vicinity of our Colin, at moments when he himself stood at a circumspect distance from the lair. Not for nothing am I the greatest sorceress yet alive," she added, lifting her chin proudly. "Hey, I never doubted you for a second," the entity said, holding up its shadowy hands limned in pale light and silently applauding. "Between you and me, I didn't dare get within sniffing distance of this place. Remember, Colin. I told you she'd spot me. That sounds very much like Colin having private conversations, which he is well within his rights to do, Tevatharis pointed out. I do not propose to share with him every secret detail of my own affairs. Do you, Imar Alafin? I have already addressed that, Imar Alafin snapped, thumping her tail on the floor for emphasis. Obviously Colin can do as he likes, within reason. None of my hobbies involve bringing enigmatic stealth-aspected deities of uncertain provenance and intention around our lair, where we all have our homes, hoards, and children. These of course being listed in order of importance, Vadaryl, she said, whereupon Tevatharis swatted her with a wing. I believe I see your point, said Izyroa, once again turning her eyes back to Colin. Very well. I would very much prefer to leave you the privacy of your own business, husband. If nothing else. I had rather looked forward to the day when you felt safe enough to share such things with us. I, as well, Tevatharis added quietly. To earn such trust is a precious thing. I much regret having the opportunity preempted. But, Izyroa continued, Imar Alafin is not incorrect, though I would personally have gone about this in a less ham-fisted way. A thing like this in particular. If it is to be loitering around our home, at least some assurances are called for. Yes. Yes, they are, Colin agreed with a sigh. Well. Now that we're all here. I apologize, to all of you, for keeping this from you. This being. Well, it is the reason I'm here. The reason for all of this. Its help is what got me here, got me to where I am. Pants, Vadaryl, she said, I hope you didn't think that was some kind of secret. Like, seriously, you snuck in here past all 6 of us and booped Atraximos on the snoot right there in that room with all the magical defenses that you definitely know what they're like by now. I promise, nobody thought you did that with your scribe powers. Indeed, said Imar Alafin. The question, then, is why did this creature feel the need to thus empower a scribe to fell Atraximos the dread and ascent to godhood? It is rather against character for any deity to empower a godling. Most of them will tend to do the opposite. What, unempower godlings? Vanomax asked. How do you do that, exactly? You kill them, Fanorax said dryly. Why? Vadaryl, she added, grinning. You curious for any specific reason, Vanomax? Shut up. All 3 of their mothers barked in unison. All 3 drakes immediately flattened themselves to the floor. Oh, my goodness, they do byplay, the entity squealed. They are adorable. Now I want some of my own. Rather insouciant little thing, isn't it? Tevatharis rumbled. Well? Imar Alafin asked pointedly. Can you reassure us, husband, that this thing which has conspired to destroy one dragon is harmless to have around? I very much cannot, Colin stated, turning to fix a stare upon the entity. It just stood there, looking particularly uncanny with its normally vague outline delineated by the spell she'd laid over it. It was still using his shadow. He currently didn't have one attached to his own feet. He could actually see its shape, thanks to the transparent of scintillating shell which lay over it. In form, it might have passed for human, except it had no face. To be clear, I owe this entity more than just my success and the place I've obtained here. I would be grateful enough for all of that, but the truth is it came to me in my most vulnerable moment, when I was as surely doomed as it's possible for a person to be. I owe it my life. I believe strongly that one must show gratitude where it is deserved, that a civilized person repays their debts, honor for honor and mercy with generosity. Tevatharis nodded in approval. But, Colin continued quietly, I still don't know why it did this. And when I was a desperate exile, I didn't ask questions of the only power in the world that deigned to help me. But now I have a family. And it's a different matter when a being as mysterious and powerful as this one insists on hanging around them without telling me what it wants. It refuses to answer the most basic questions about its motivations or interests, or why it bothered with me at all. what it gained from elevating me, or destroying Atraximos, or whether any of that was actually what it was trying to do. Alafin is right, we need some simple assurance. That's all I want, all I asked for. Just let me understand. He shifted his focus from the dragons to the entity as he spoke. Who are you? What are you? Why have you done all this? Why do you care? If there are good answers, then I will be glad to repay your aid in whatever way I can. If there aren't, then I can't have you looming over the heads of those I love. All three of his consorts now drew themselves up to their full, truly intimidating heights, arching their long necks to glare menacingly down at their captive. You are an honorable guy, White No, the entity said. Its tone, as always, was light. But now it was also soft, the usual sauciness traded for a gentler delivery. Just so. Decent. It's one of the best things about you, Colin, and a big part of why I chose you. But your selective application of that trait is frustrating. And this is what it's been like, Colin said in exasperation, shrugging and looking up at the looming faces of his wives. I ask a simple question and I get something like that. Anything other than an explanation that tells me how worried I should be. A disappointingly standard gambit, from such a novel being, Tevathyres stated flatly. The response of every cornered manipulator. And the answer to our question, Izyroa growled. You have our thanks, Spirit, for the aid you have rendered our husband. Alafin, what are our options for getting rid of this thing? It's not so easy, with gods, but it is doable, the White Dragon answered. Magical might alone won't do it, but they are creatures so inherently tied to a domain, it is possible to render one's own domain incompatible with theirs. I can manage. I am concerned, said Tevathyres, by the fact that this is very clearly a god of deception, among other nuances we do not even know. Look at the approach it took with Colin. This creature operates by moving others to do its bidding. Banishing it from our own home will leave it with the entire rest of the world's inhabitants as its arsenal. I think that's overstating it, but fundamentally not wrong, Izyroa agreed. Then it would seem we have a problem. Unless you want to spit it out? Colin prompted, again staring at the entity. No matter what you are, the personal enmity of all these dragons is not something you need. This would be so easy if you'd just give us a straight answer. Oh, Colin, the entity chided, wagging an unusually distinct finger at him. You are so close to being right. It is excruciatingly true that a simple answer is what will resolve all this. Almost, you're almost there. It's just that. I'm not the one who needs to give that answer. And again it turns the question around on you, Tevathyres snorted. Husband, the best approach to beings such as this is often not to engage with them at all. Words are its weapon and its battlefield. Colin himself is hardly unarmed in that arena, Izyroa said quietly, nor are we. Tell them, the entity urged. Tell them the truth. All of it. You need to tell them, not me. That kind of detail may be germane, said Alafin. Positioning people and events and revelations just so is often a component of divine machinations. Tell them, the entity commanded, now turned fully to face Colin and ignoring the dragons, why you needed my help. All of it, Colin. You heard the lady, I'm a spirit of deception. The truth from me means nothing and helps no one. Tell them your truth. Despite themselves, all the dragons shifted their heads to stare at Colin directly. He kept his own gaze fixed on the entity, frowning in concentration. Yes. That's what you wanted from the beginning, Colin said slowly. For me to rally the dragons. To attack those who've wronged me. Why? Why do you want that? Husband, you show more wisdom than I think you know, Tevathyres interjected in a ringing tone, stepping forward so that she towered intimidatingly over the entity. Any enemy will attempt to maneuver you into making a mistake. When the enemy is a god, these actions have weight, an ontological force that can reshape the world around you. And when you are a godling, Alafin chimed in, Any significant actions you take will powerfully shape the kind of being you become. Which tells us, at least in part, what this thing wants. It's trying to determine your divine aspect, to control what kind of god you grow into. A god of revenge, Izyroa hissed, lowering her head to bare her teeth directly at the entity. As it is. Stealth, manipulation, and vengeance, Phenorexa murmured. This increasingly sounds like an enemy we don't want. Looks like that ship has sailed, sister, said Vidaralshi. You have done well, husband, Tevathyris stated, to resist these manipulations. Remember that from now on, your battles are also ours. And we are able to defend our home and family against far worse than this, Izyroa agreed, snorting contemptuously down at the entity. Been a while since I've had any worthwhile opposition, Imaralafine said, her lips curling up in an unpleasant smile. That might be just the thing. I'd hate to get all soft. Oh, beans, the entity sighed. I had so hoped you'd do the right thing, Colin. Oh, well. Then the casing of pale light around it shattered like an eggshell, its fragments spinning away and dissolving into gossamer streamers of glitter. Imaralafine snarled in displeasure, flaring her wings. All three of the elder dragons drew upon magic, as the drakes began hastily backing away. But that's all right. The unleashed form of the entity grew, rising up until it towered over even the dragons, spreading arms which cast darkness across the room. Shadows formed and danced across the ancient time-stone walls, blotting out even the glow of Tameglas with unnatural strength. In the darkness, the dragons retreated warily, bringing up defensive spells of their own. All around the suddenly darkened chamber, luminous blue forms stood out as the Phantom Legion materialized in force, assembling in formation with their spectral weapons aimed at the dark shape of the entity. So you missed one chance to do what's right, the Dark God continued, and its cheerful tone filled the room with an inexplicable, existential force that slowed all their reactions to a crawl. Nobody's perfect. We all have our failures and regrets. You're a good egg, my boy, and I know you'll go on to do great things, and more importantly, good things. But for this one time, I guess it falls to me to tell you all the tale of Arkansas Conzelliker. Tope continued,